So hi everyone, I'm Dr. Deepthi and today I would be discussing the obs and gynae questions of the latest FMG exam of June 2021, right? So let's try and see. I have quite a few recalls for the others. There is, a large part of the question that we know, but some of the options may be missing, okay? So let's look at the first question. So the first question is, a patient comes, she has a karyotype of 46XX. There is an absent uterus, absent vagina, with normal secondary sexual characters. The ovary is present and the LH and FSH are in normal limits. What is the diagnosis? Right, so let's look at this. What do you think is the answer to this question? Okay, so once they say ovary is present, right, the Turner syndrome is ruled out. So we all know there are absent ovaries or there are streak gonads. Yes, and also the karyotype is not of Turner's, right? In Turner syndrome it is 45XO. What is between MRKH and AIS? So androgen insensitivity syndrome, you should all know, is 46XY. So it's not an XX chromosome. And in androgen insensitivity syndrome, there is going to be testes. So the gonad is testes, not the ovary. Also, when you talk about androgen insensitivity syndrome, no doubt the uterus is absent. Okay, and when we talk about vagina in AIS, it is a blind ending vagina. Okay, but what is important here is that in androgen insensitivity syndrome, the breast development is present. Okay, so breast development is present, there are well-developed breasts, so secondary sexual characters are well-developed, but please remember that the pubic as well as the axillary hair, right? So pubic as well as axillary hair, they may be completely absent, they may be sparse. So the pubic and axillary hair cannot be normal in AIS, right? Now, MRKH, yes, so Mayer-Rokitansky-Kastner-Hauser syndrome or simply the Rokitansky syndrome is what is the answer here, right? So please remember here there is an absent uterus, there is an absent vagina, okay? The karyotype is absolutely normal and therefore the ovaries are present, and because the ovaries are present and there is no abnormality in the hypothalamic and the pituitary axis, so the entire HPO axis is normal, and as a result of which the LH and FSH levels are normal, the secondary sexual character development is also normal, right? So the answer here is going to be MRKH syndrome, okay? Let's look at the next question. So this is a patient with 3 months amenorrhea after abortion and the serum FSH is 6 international units. What is the most likely diagnosis? All right, so when we talk about, 3 months amenorrhea, and the key here is after an abortion. The moment we say this, you should know that, in an abortion, there is a possibility of a curettage being done, and which can always lead to Asherman syndrome. Yes, so actually the answer is Asherman syndrome here, but what I want to tell you is when you have this history of instrumentation, yes, of the uterus, so history of instrumentation of the uterus, you should know that it can lead to Asherman syndrome. But what is the other important thing here is that in Asherman syndrome, the LH and FSH levels are going to be absolutely normal, right? And amongst the menstrual irregularities, the most common presentation is amenorrhea, followed by hypomenorrhea. So menstrual irregularities are the most common presentation in Asherman's, and within this group I said the most common is amenorrhea followed by hypomenorrhea, right? Why cannot it be premature ovarian failure? Because when you say ovarian failure, you have to know that ovaries do a feedback inhibition of the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So if it is ovarian failure, the FSH levels have to be high, not normal, right? So the FSH levels in premature ovarian failure are the menopausal level. So they will be more than or equal to 40 international units. right? But when we say 6 international units, this is what is normal. Now, please understand, when you say normal FSH levels, it's a wide range. So we say less than 10 international units is what is considered as normal. And we do FSH levels anywhere between day 2 to day 4 of the menstrual cycle. But in women with amenorrhea, it can be done at any time. Okay. The most common day when we do FSH levels has to be answered as day 3. Now, why can it not be a fresh pregnancy? Now, please remember, in pregnancy, the LH and FSH, both the levels are greatly suppressed. Although they'll be in the normal range, but they're towards the lower side. So, in a normal pregnancy, right, so when we talk about pregnancy, the FSH levels are usually going to be between 1 to 3 international units. They are suppressed levels because of the high amounts of estrogen and progesterone, so which are doing a feedback inhibition. Now, when it comes to Sheehan syndrome, what about Sheeman's? So if you talk about Sheehan's, you know it is postpartum, right? Pituitary apoplexy, right? So pituitary ischemia is there, which is usually, the leading thing in the MCQ for Sheehan's is going to be a massive or a severe postpartum hemorrhage. And as a result of which there is a pituitary ischemia, right? And the pituitary typically, please remember, the anterior pituitary undergoes infarction, right? So all the hormones that come from the anterior pituitary are going to be suppressed again. So when it comes to Sheehan's, you cannot have normal FSH. It has to be low levels of FSH hormone in Sheehan syndrome, right? So please remember, the most common presentation of Sheehan is what? It is failure to lactate. So the most common presentation of Sheehan's is failure of lactation. So although the woman has just now given birth, she is not able to breastfeed the child. Why? Because of the absence of prolactin, right? And the second most common presentation of Sheehan's is amenorrhea. So these women will have persistent amenorrhea despite the fact that they are not breastfeeding. Their menses does not return, so they remain amenorrheic, right? So these are the other questions we are likely to get from these topics as well. Okay, right? So as I said, the answer to this question is going to be Asherman syndrome. Okay, let's look at the next question. So we have a 16-year-old girl, and now she has primary amenorrhea. She has well-developed secondary sexual characters, and on examination there is a bluish bulging membrane. I think there was an image as well here, but even if there was no image, the question is quite self-explanatory. The moment we say the woman has primary amenorrhea and she has a bluish bulging membrane on examination or local examination, we know what are we talking about? We are talking about imperforate hymen, right? So we're talking about imperforate hymen. And the other thing that goes in favor is that in imperforate hymen, there is a normal karyotype of the female. So it is going to be 46XX. Okay. Then there are going to be absolutely normal ovaries. They will have normal hormones. And they will have what? Normal secondary sexual characters. So all these things are going to be normal in imperforate hymen. Now let's look at the answers. So you all know, once it is imperforate hymen, what is happening is there is a normal uterus. She is going to have monthly bleeding, and therefore if they make the question more clinical, they will say that this woman experiences, or this girl experiences, monthly or cyclical pain, right? So that's what they will say in the MCQ. And because it is cyclical pain, the reason is that she is menstruating, she's having dysmenorrhea, but all this blood is collecting in the uterus and in the vagina. So these women will have what? Hematocolpos and hematometra. Yes? Now what you need to know is that sometimes these collections can become really large, right? So if a hematocolpos, which is a collection in the vagina, becomes large, it can compress the bladder outflow tract, and therefore sometimes these girls can present to the emergency department, right, with acute urinary retention. So they can also present with acute urinary retention, right? What is the treatment? The treatment is a cruciate incision on the membrane, right? So you will give a cruciate incision, you will drain the hematocolpos, the hematometra, right? And that is what is the treatment for imperforate hymen, right? Now please remember, sometimes we do confuse imperforate hymen from a vaginal septum. So some of the students get confused. Please remember that if it is a vaginal septum, number one, this is usually much higher up in the vagina, right? So usually in the upper 1/3 of the vagina. So in this case, when it's a vaginal septa as a cause of primary amenorrhea, the septa will be higher up. So what I'm trying to say is you will see a part of the vagina. Whereas in imperforate hymen, you will not see any part of the vagina because the membrane is right at the opening of the vagina. The second thing that you have to remember is that septum is fibrotic tissue. Okay, so it is going to be much more thick. Whereas when you talk about imperforate hymen, it's a thin membrane. So as a result, the membrane bulges. But this fibrotic tissue, because it is thick, even though there is a collection behind it, it is not going to bulge. Third thing that I want you to know is cough impulse. So when you talk about cough impulse, that will be negative in vaginal septum because of the thick tissue. So cough impulse will be absent here, whereas cough impulse can be present in imperforate hymen, which is a thin membrane. Okay, let's go further. So your patient is a 55-year-old woman. She is found to have carcinoma cervix stage 3B. What is the management? So please remember, when you talk about cancer cervix, two things that I want you to always remember is that if the tissue is, or if the tumor is more than or equal to 4 centimeters in size, or it has spread to parametrium or beyond, right? So either it is too big in size, bigger than or equal to 4 centimeters, or it has spread to the parametrium or even beyond, like the lateral pelvic walls. So whenever it is going to be like this, then the treatment has to be chemoradiation. Okay, then the treatment has to be chemoradiation, right? So which is what is option number B. That's the answer here. Concurrent chemoradiation. Concurrent matlab dono saath mein dena hai. So chemotherapy and radiotherapy both will be given together. Yes. Now please remember, what is stage 3B? So remember, 3A is when the cancer has spread to the lower 1/3 of vagina. Yes. So that is what is 3A. What is 3B? Cancer has spread to lateral pelvic wall. Right? Also remember, when we say it is spreading to the lateral pelvic wall, an indirect way of saying this is, we may say that the patient has hydroureter on CT scan. So what you have to know is that these days, CT scan, MRI, PET scan, they're all allowed to change the stage. So if you see a hydroureter on the CT scan, yes, you will change the stage to stage 3B. And as per the latest classification, you should know that now we have stage 3C as well, where 3C, 1 is involvement of pelvic lymph nodes and 2 is involvement of para-aortic lymph nodes, right? So please remember that this is the new FIGO staging, and as I said, once it is beyond the cervix, that means it has entered the parametrium or even more further, the treatment has to be chemoradiation. Okay? What chemotherapeutic agent do we use? So most commonly we are going to use cisplatin. But other than that, we can also use 5-fluorouracil. So most common is cisplatin, but we can also use 5-fluorouracil. Please remember, whenever we are giving radiotherapy, we can give a combination of external beam and brachytherapy. Okay? So when the tumor is too big, we'll give a combination of both. The most important thing that I want you to remember is when we talk about these two, that pehle sequence mein we will give EBRT. So first we give external beam radiotherapy और उसके बाद we give or switch over to brachytherapy. So this I wanted to reinforce because इसमें एक option है where it says intracavitary brachy followed by EBRT. No, it's actually the reverse. You first give EBRT and then you start with intracavitary brachytherapy. Okay? Let's look at the next one. So a couple presented with infertility. The woman also complains of menorrhagia. The semen analysis is normal. And on HST, there is a distal dilatation. Yes? Now, when we talk about, distal dilatation, it typically means a distal block. Right? So what we are trying to say is that probably the fimbrial end of the tube is blocked. And that is why the dye is collecting there. Okay. Now, once we understand that it is a distal block, we are going to rule out tubal spasm because a spasm is going to cause a proximal block. Okay, or a cornual block. It will not produce a distal block. Right? Again, tubal polyp. That is not going to be seen like a collection of dye. In fact, it will be seen as a filling defect. Right? So polyp is going to be seen as a filling defect. Right? Now we're left with tuberculosis and salpingitis. Now since, the keyword here is menorrhagia, I would, say that the better answer here is going to be salpingitis. Why? Because when we talk about tuberculosis, what is the, presentation? Yes, women with tuberculosis or genital tuberculosis can have menstrual irregularities. But again, the most common menstrual irregularities seen in tuberculosis are amenorrhea, followed by oligomenorrhea. Right? Whereas when you say salpingitis, we are talking about pelvic inflammatory disease. And yes, pelvic inflammatory disease can also present with menstrual irregularities apart from pain and things like that, right? And the more commoner menstrual irregularity that you see with pelvic inflammatory disease is menorrhagia. So unless something else was also given in the question, we would take it as salpingitis or pelvic inflammatory disease. All right? Now, there is a woman who has a history of previous cesarean and she's presenting with prolonged labor. So we already have two keywords, previous cesarean and prolonged labor. Patient is now hypotensive, FHR is not audible and fetal parts are easily palpable on an abdominal examination. What is the diagnosis? Now, so, all the things here are going to correlate with uterine rupture, right? So as I said, look at the keywords. Previous history of a cesarean section. So this is the most common cause of rupture uterus, right? Second hint is prolonged labor, right? So that is usually when the rupture uterus will happen. This is exactly why the woman is hypotensive. There is intraperitoneal bleeding if there is a rupture uterus. FHR is not audible. Why? Because the baby is expelled into the abdominal cavity and the baby loses its connection with the placenta and therefore the blood flow. Right? So the baby is going to die and that is why the fetal heart rate is not audible. Because the baby has come out of the uterus into the abdominal cavity, the fetal parts become superficially palpable. But please hold on here. Sometimes if there is a lot of intraperitoneal bleeding, there will be signs of peritonitis. Yes? So if there are signs of peritonitis, there is rigidity, right? There is guarding. So if there are those features of peritonitis, then it is possible that fetal parts may not be pelled easily. So all I'm trying to say is you have to understand that both the things are possible in rupture uterus. What are both the things? The fetal parts may be easily palpable or the fetal parts may not be easily palpable. That will depend upon the amount of intraperitoneal bleeding. If the intraperitoneal bleeding is large and there is peritonitis, there is guarding, rigidity, then you will not be able to feel the fetal parts easily. Okay, so it is going to be uterine rupture. On the other hand, if you look at other things, polyhydramnios, yes, in polyhydramnios, the fetal parts will not be easily felt because of more amount of liquor. Uterus will be over distended or fundal height will be more than period of gestation, but this has no linkage to previous cesarean or prolonged labor, right? Abruption. Again, please remember in abruption, there is going to be history of bleeding, and we do have another question on that. So there is going to be history of bleeding, there's going to be a tense, tender uterus. The most important thing that you have to know between abruption and rupture is that in abruption, the uterine contour is very well felt. Okay? So abruption uterine contour is easily felt. And as I said, it's a tense, tender uterus. But when you talk about uterine rupture, the contour of the uterus is lost. Right? So the uterine contour is lost. Even in abruption, the fetal heart rate can be absent, and if she has bled massively, she may be hypertensive, but that is less common. Why do I say that? Because a more common association of abruption is with preeclampsia. So it's, these women will generally have blood pressures towards the higher range, and even when they bleed quite a lot, the blood pressure would still not be in the hypertensive ranges, right? So looking at the characteristic history here, we are going to keep it as uterine rupture. Please remember the most characteristic or specific symptom of rupture uterus is what? Loss of station, right? What do we mean by loss of station? If the fetal head is coming down, you all know that the station changes from -3 to -2 to -1, then 0, then it will come to +1, +2, +3. But when you say loss of station, it actually goes in the reverse direction. For example, if it is or if it was at 0 station and there is a rupture uterus, it may now go back to -3. That's because the baby is expelled upwards, okay, into the abdominal cavity. Yes, so that is going to be the most specific symptom of uterine rupture, okay. And please remember that the most important thing to differentiate abruption and rupture is the uterine contour. Yes, so if the contour is well felt, it's a tense and a tender uterus, that's more likely to be abruption. But if you cannot feel the boundary of the uterus well, which means the contour is lost, and in rupture there is a generalized tenderness in the abdomen. It's not the uterus which is particularly tender. The entire abdomen is tender, which is because of peritonitis, right? Okay. A woman presents with few weeks of spotting and bleeding per vaginum for 3 months, and now she is coming with heavy bleeding. She gives history of DNC at some other hospital, but she still continues to bleed. Now there are 2 versions of this question that I got as a recall. So first is this version, which I have written for you, and then I will tell you the second version as well. Okay, the second version of the recall from the students was a little shorter one. They said, it was simply a postpartum patient with history of bleeding, okay, for probably 3 months, for which she has undergone DNC. What is the likely cause? Okay. So these are the 2 versions of the recall that I got. So one is patient who is postpartum and she is bleeding for last 3 months, and for which she has undergone a DNC, and they are asking you what is the cause. So if this was the question in the exam, right, where they are saying bleeding in a postpartum patient for 3 months for which she's undergone a DNC, if this is the recall, then this is likely to be because of retained placenta. Right? So if that was the question which you got in the exam, then the answer is retained placenta, right? So it is possible that it's not the entire placenta which is left behind, but small bits and pieces of placental tissue actually are left behind, right? So it cannot be entire placenta retained for 3 months. It will be, bits or tissues or membranes of the placenta which are left behind, which are causing secondary PPH. So I hope you remember what is secondary PPH. Bleeding beyond 24 hours up to 12 weeks postpartum. That's what is secondary PPH, right? But what I feel is that was not the question, because then they wouldn't say retained placenta. They will say retained placental tissue. So I actually think that this is the one that I have given in the recall is actually the question, which is that she was having spotting off and on for 3 months, and now she has come with heavy bleeding, right? And she has given a history of DNC earlier, but she is still continuing to bleed. Now, please remember, if it's heavy bleeding, this is not what is normal lochia. So you all know that normal lochia is rubra, serosa, and alba. Yes, so that's the order. So this is not going to be a normal lochia. Now DIC, again, DIC doesn't really present like this. So DIC is consumptive coagulopathy, and it will not happen 3 months after delivery, right? That she's been bleeding off and on, and now she's going into DIC. So no. Retained placenta, again, in this particular format cannot be the answer, because then she's already undergone DNC and she's still bleeding after DNC. So agar DNC kiya hai humne, then we would have removed the placental tissue. So now it has to be something else. So then the answer becomes gestational trophoblastic neoplasia, right? So probably she is developing GTN, for which she is presenting as bleeding. So that is a very common presentation for GTN, because when you talk about a full term pregnancy, and if we talk about gestational trophoblastic neoplasia developing after full term, which one do you think it is going to be? Yes, so it is going to be a choriocarcinoma. So they can present with bleeding, they can present with lung metastasis, they can present with vaginal metastasis. It can also present with subinvolution of the uterus, right? So uterus will be still enlarged, not gone back to the pre-pregnant size, right? So those are the other presentations, which is what is the likely answer here. So anyways, I have given you both formats of the questions and answers accordingly. Okay, so what is the complication associated with IV bolus oxytocin? So you all know that, whenever you want to give oxytocin IV, we are giving it as an IV infusion. Yes, and not as IV bolus. The reason is that if you give large doses of oxytocin IV bolus, it is going to cause severe hypotension. Yes, so it can cause severe hypertension, which can cause a reflex tachycardia, right? Even arrhythmias, even an MI and a cardiac arrest, right? So that is why we will not give it as an IV bolus, we will give it as IV infusion. Also remember, when you are making this IV infusion, you should not make it in 5% dextrose. So make these infusions in either RL or normal saline. Why? Because if you give large doses of oxytocin, right, and you give it in a electrolyte deficient media, which is what is 5% dextrose. It is an electrolyte deficient media. So if you give large dose of oxytocin in electrolyte deficient media for a long time, which you might have to give for PPH, what will it cause? Then it will cause a rare complication called as water intoxication, right? So water intoxication is a less common side effect, but yes, is seen with oxytocin because it also has ADH-like action, okay? Right, let's move further. Right, so that was a graph or a pictorial question for you. Which of the following peak is responsible for ovulation, right? So they had given this graph and they had mentioned it as A, B, C and D, right? So as you can see, A is luteinizing hormone, right? This was a very easy question. So we all know that LH surge is what is responsible for ovulation. So LH surge, which then leads to LH peak, yes, and then leads to ovulation. What is the time gap between LH peak and ovulation? This is 12 hours. And what is the time gap between LH surge and ovulation? It is around 36 hours, right? So that is the time gap which is also asked as an MCQ. And if we go further, what is responsible for LH surge? So estrogen. So please remember, high amounts of estrogen is what is required to initiate the LH surge. Another thing that I want you all to remember is that before ovulation, you will see increase in levels of LH as well as increase in levels of FSH, as you can see here from the graph. Right, so you will see increase in the levels of LH as well as increase in the levels of LH, but the levels of LH increase much more than that of FSH. So the peak is much bigger for luteinizing hormone as compared to follicle stimulating hormone. But please remember that there is increase in both these hormones, right? So both are required for the process of ovulation. Okay. A 23-year-old primate presents to her physician at 18 weeks with fasting blood sugar of more than 126 milligrams per deciliter and HbA1c more than 6.5. So you all know that these are criteria for diabetes mellitus, right? So which we use, outside pregnancy. So this is, or she is likely going to be a case of pre-gestational diabetes mellitus, right? So, we say what are the values that are required to make a diagnosis of diabetes? So fasting blood sugar more than or equal to 126, okay? HbA1c more than or equal to 6.5 and 2-hour PP or random glucose blood levels which are more than or equal to 200. So all these are used to make a diagnosis of diabetes, and this is how we make a diagnosis of pre-gestational diabetes. Yes, remember, for gestational diabetes mellitus, what criteria do we follow? We follow the DIPSI criteria, right? Where we give a 75 grams of oral glucose, take a blood sample after 2 hours, and that is why it is also called as 2-hour OGTT, right? And if the value is more than or equal to 140, we call it as gestational diabetes mellitus, right? All right, let's go on to the next question. So false statement regarding the following image is, so this is a MVA syringe, okay, which is what we use. It's a bivalve syringe now. Right, and so this is an MVA syringe. This is also one of the questions that I gave in the revision sessions before the FMG exam. Yes, so please remember, MVA is a manual vacuum aspiration. So obviously, it does not use electricity. That is a true statement. In fact, it is an alternative to suction and evacuation. So because it is an alternative to suction and evacuation, it can be done up to 12 weeks. So this is also a true statement, right? It creates a negative pressure of 660 millimeters of mercury. That's a true statement, right? So we say 660 is a better answer than 600. Both can be used as answers depending on which one is given in the options. So answer here is the capacity is 30 ml. The capacity is actually 60 ml. Please do not confuse it with a MR syringe, a menstrual regulation syringe, which is usually a single valve syringe, right? And it has a capacity of 50 ml. So MR syringe was used earlier. It had a lesser capacity and it was usually a single valve syringe. Yes. So MVA can also be single valve as well as double valve, but what comes in the typical kit is a double valve syringe, yes, with a capacity of 60 ml, right? Okay. So a 24-year-old primee attends the antenatal clinic with a blood pressure of 160 by 120. There are increased liver enzymes, increased LDH and low platelet count. So pretty obvious that the answer here is HELLP syndrome. So this patient has evidence of hemolysis. So what is the evidence of hemolysis here? It is raised LDH. Yes, that's the evidence of hemolysis. We already know she has elevated liver enzymes. That's given directly in the question, and she has a low platelet count. So the answer here is HELLP syndrome. Okay. Now, remember, out of all the options given to us, high blood pressure is what is linked to HELLP syndrome. But having said that, you should know that around 15% of women with HELLP syndrome, right, can have normal blood pressure. So इसीलिए हम क्या बोलते हैं that high blood pressure is not a mandatory requirement to make a diagnosis of HELLP, but yes, 80 to 85% of times these women with HELLP syndrome will have high blood pressure. Okay. For acute fatty liver of pregnancy, how would you differentiate? So if your question has evidence of hypoglycemia, increasing serum creatinine, secondary complications like pancreatitis, okay, increased ammonia levels, then you should go and mark the answer as acute fatty liver of pregnancy. Yes, acute fatty liver can also be associated with high blood pressure, but it has a less commoner association as compared to HELLP syndrome. Hepatitis, you all know, the woman in acute hepatitis will have severely raised, liver enzymes, very high bilirubin levels. There will be symptoms of fever, malaise, loss of appetite, right? While obstetric cholestasis classically presents with pruritus. It doesn't present with, a high blood pressure or, epigastric pain. So please remember, when it comes to HELLP syndrome, the most common symptom of HELLP syndrome is pain, right? So this is usually pain in the right hypochondrium or in the epigastrium, right? Okay, so which type of pelvis is associated with persistent OP? This is again a direct question from the revision series I did just before the exam. So please remember, android pelvis is what is linked with OP. But whenever the question says persistent OP or direct OP or face to pubes, yes, all these are related to anthropoid pelvis, which is an antero-posteriorly oval pelvis. On the other hand, if the question is most common cause of occipito-posterior, then the answer is android, followed by deflexed head. Okay, followed by deflexed head. Platyploid pelvis is something which is associated with face presentation as well as brow presentation. And this is what students get confused with. Don't get confused between face to pubes and face, right? So when we say face to pubes, and that's a typical question for your exams, you should answer it as anthropoid. Don't answer it as platyploid, okay? Okay, an intern conducting delivery observes mother developing breathlessness, hypotension, tachycardia, and she's collapsing. The shock is out of proportion to the bleeding. What is the cause? So this is a typical presentation of amniotic fluid embolism. Sudden onset of breathlessness, okay, followed by development of hypotension, cardiac arrest, and coma, right? And the progression of these symptoms is really, really fast. So this is a typical presentation of amniotic fluid embolism, which is also called as anaphylactoid syndrome of pregnancy. Remember, it has a very high mortality rate. This is actually the first phase of AFE. And you know, most women with AFE will not survive. So as I said, it has a high mortality rate. But if women do survive, they will actually enter the second phase of amniotic fluid embolism, which is characterized by DIC and bleeding. Yes. So, so this is, as I said, a classic presentation of AFE. Right? Please remember, when it comes to uterine inversion, there will be no history of breathlessness. Okay? Uterine inversion में breathlessness नहीं होता, ना ही immediate hypotension होता है. Yes, they go into shock, but what kind of shock they first go into? It is neurogenic shock. It is not a cardiogenic shock. Right? So they go into neurogenic shock because of the intense pull on the ligaments. And you know, in inversion uterus, you will actually see the big uterus lying outside vagina, and on a PA exam, the uterine fundus will not be felt. That's the classic description of inversion uterus. Okay. Now, a 25-year-old primate who is a known case of bipolar disorder is on lithium therapy since 2 years. What is the anomaly seen with lithium? So that's again an easy one. We all know this is going to be Epstein's anomaly. Yes, so some of these, teratogens you must know, your exams are repeatedly asking. So, Epstein's anomaly is with lithium. Then please remember Mobius syndrome. This is what you see with misoprostol, right? There is involvement of the 6th and 7th nerve. Right, that is with misoprostol. Then remember with retinoic acid, the classic thing that will be written in the exams will be microtia and anotia. Thalidomide. What do you see with thalidomide? Phocomelia. Yes. Okay, you would see phocomelia. Then fetal alcohol syndrome is something which has been very frequently asked. So it's a combination of growth restriction, okay, plus microcephaly, plus the characteristic facial features. Okay, so in the facial features, they have a thin vermilion border, they have a smooth philtrum, right? So that's the classic, and the epicanth, there are very narrow eyes. So those are the characteristic facial features. Okay, so it's a triad which leads to FAS or fetal alcohol syndrome, right? And then I'm sure you all know that when it comes to anti-epileptics, it can be neural tube defects as well as cardiovascular defects. Yes, so those are some of the common ones. Warfarin I will talk about because we had a direct question on it, so I'll talk about warfarin as well. And that's the next question. Okay. A pregnant woman with prosthetic heart valves is on warfarin and now she is tested positive for pregnancy. What is to be given? So you have to replace warfarin with heparin, right? So please remember, warfarin is teratogenic. It is going to cause warfarin embryopathy. Yes? And we said that warfarin embryopathy is going to resemble what? Chondrodysplasia punctata. Where what do you see? You will see stippled epiphysis. Yes. And you will see nasal bone hypoplasia. So basically the cartilage development is affected, right? So warfarin should not be given in the first trimester in these women with prosthetic heart valves. So what we do is up to 12 weeks, we will replace warfarin with low molecular weight heparin. Then from 12 weeks on to 36 weeks, we will put them on warfarin. And from 36 weeks to onset of labor, we are again going to put them on low molecular weight heparin, right? And during labor, the anticoagulation will be stopped, right? So you are doing a switch over 2 times. So at 12 weeks, you are switching over from heparin to warfarin, and at 36 weeks, you are switching over from warfarin to heparin. Yes, so close to delivery, we don't want to give her heparin because heparin, we don't want to give her warfarin because warfarin freely crosses placenta, right? So it is going to go into the baby in therapeutic levels. So when this baby with therapeutic levels of warfarin is going to come out of the maternal genital tract, it can have a lot of bleeding inside, right? So the baby will have a lot of bleeding in those cases. So we don't want to give warfarin close to delivery, right? So we replace it with low molecular weight heparin, which, is not going to cross placenta, will not reach the baby. And also we have an antidote for LMW, right? So in case the mother bleeds a little more, we can give her protamine sulfate. Yes? Okay. So a pregnant woman comes for checkup at 18 weeks. On examination, the uterus corresponds to 16 weeks. So here, the fundal height is less than period of gestation. And the association is oligohydramnios. So because of less liquor, the fundal height is less. So which of the following is the likely cause? So this is again a very easy one. The answer is renal agenesis. Yes, because when we talk about anencephaly or fetal anemia, there's going to be polyhydramnios in both these conditions. Remember, in fetal anemia, whenever there is severe anemia in the baby, what is the baby going to do? The baby wants to reduce the load on the heart, and therefore the baby is going to do polyuria, and because of which there will be polyhydramnios. In anencephaly, there is decreased swallowing, which is the main reason for polyhydramnios. Renal agenesis is the answer here, which you all know is associated with oliguria, and therefore oligohydramnios. Yes, hydrocephalus, again in hydrocephalus, depending on what are the other associations, it can be associated with polyhydramnios, or it will be associated with a big sized head. In both the conditions, the fundal height will be more than the POG, not less than POG. So hydrocephalus is unlikely the answer here, okay, because it has no association with oligo. It can again have an association with poly, depending on whether the baby has other malformations or not. Yes? Okay. So which of the following is the most cheap cervical screening test was the question, which I got as a recall from one bunch of students, and the other bunch is most cost effective. Either which ways, whether the question was cost effective or cheap, the answer is going to be VIA, right? So visual inspection with acetic acid. And this is why WHO, is recommending VIA in resource-limited countries, right? So in resource-limited countries, the recommendation is to go and do VIA, right? PAPS, it may seem to you that it is cheap, but it is not, and it is difficult to do PAPS at, village level. So the fixatives are not there, the spatulas are not there, right? HPV DNA is very expensive. Most women are not able to afford it. And colposcopy, again, is an expensive procedure, right? And it is more actually, used in tertiary care centers because of the equipment that requires cost, right? Now, please remember when it comes to VIA, if you apply acetic acid, which is 3 to 5% acetic acid, the aceto-white areas are what are abnormal areas, right, which are likely to have dysplasia, and these are the areas from which you should take a biopsy. Yes? Okay. So I think that's pretty much, but I really want to say something here. Please remember, when it comes to pap smear, it has higher specificity, okay, as compared to HPV DNA testing, because that's another place where students get confused. And when you talk about HPV DNA testing, it has a higher sensitivity. Okay? Right, so that was an image-based question where they had probably asked, what is this? So this is a Bartholin cyst, typically identified because it lies in the posterolateral wall of vagina. Okay, so it's located in the posterolateral wall of vagina. 5 and 7 o'clock positions are the positions of the cyst most commonly, right? And please remember that as compared to this, when you talk about Gartner's cyst is located in the anterolateral wall of vagina, right? And please remember that Bartholin's cyst, if it is asymptomatic, right, and less than 3 centimeters, then the answer is no treatment. But be careful, once they say that the size is bigger than 3 centimeters, it should be treated. Okay, and then you treat it with incision and drainage. Abscess ke liye, hamesha you will do an IND initially. Yes, for cyst, I'm saying if it is asymptomatic, don't do any treatment, but the key is the size. If they give you a size which is bigger than 3 centimeters, then you should treat it and treat it with incision and drainage. Only if it is recurrent cyst. मतलब एक बार हुआ आपने IND किया, 2 बार हुआ आपने IND किया. So if it recurs more than 2 times, then you should go ahead and do a marsupialization. Marsupialization is not the initial treatment, okay? Let's look at the next one. So 26-year-old Gravida 4 presents with history of 3 previous mid-trimester abortions at 22 weeks. With now she is coming at 22 weeks with a cervical length of 15 mm. What is the possible cause of miscarriage? So classical history of mid-trimester abortions. Right? Recurrent abortions. And the other important keyword which I could not get in the recall, but you should always know, is painless or with no symptoms. Is the classic history of cervical incompetence. Here the keyword that they have given is, they have not given painless, but what they have given is cervical length. And you all know that in the second trimester, if cervical length is less than or equal to 2.5 centimeters or 25 mm, we will make a diagnosis of cervical incompetence. And in this patient, in the current pregnancy, what should you do for her? Because she has a classic history, she has a short cervix, she should go in for cervical cerclage. Yes, and along with the cerclage, we will also give progesterone therapy to her, right? So we'll put a cerclage and we will also give a progesterone therapy. Yes, some of you are wondering, ma'am, can we do cerclage at 22? Yes, cerclage can be done up to 24 weeks, okay? The ideal time to do it is 12 to 14, but it can be done up to 24 weeks. Okay, so a patient at 37 weeks, presents to your labor room. She has mild labor pains for 10 hours and the cervix is persistently 1 centimeter dilated. So she is still in the latent phase of labor. And we've taught you many times, what are you going to do as a management of, latent phase of labor? So please remember, you are going to do a wait and watch. There is no need to augment with oxytocin initially or do our ARM, or there is no indication for CS. So what you should initially do for the patient is wait and watch. But a better answer than wait and watch is sedation, right? Because, you want to take care of the pain as well. So we say pain relief and adequate rest is what is the initial treatment of latent phase. Once you have given her sedation or adequate rest and pain relief, then yes, you can augment with oxytocin. But initially you should, what I said is, give her adequate pain relief and rest, right? Also, please remember, when does active phase of labor begin? So please remember, as per the newer guidelines, the active phase of labor is at and beyond 6 centimeters dilatation. It's not 4. 4 is the answer for partograph. So if they typically ask you on the partograph, when does active phase begin? Only there you will answer it as 4 centimeters. Otherwise, it is now at 6 centimeters. Okay? Right. So one of the recalls that I got also was, what is the most common cause of DIC in obstetrics? Right? And this is abruption. So yes, abruption is the most common cause of DIC in obstetrics. The other causes are any form of massive hemorrhage. It can be a severe PPH. It can be a severe APH, right? Septicemia, intrauterine death, right? So these are some of the other causes of DIC, right? So PPH, APH, septicemias, intrauterine death, and abruption. Okay? Right. So this was one of the other visual questions that came, where we had to tell what is this. Okay. So this, if I put it as number 1, is a submucosal polyp, fibroid. Yes, so it is a submucosal fibroid, but what you have to know, it is a pedunculated submucosal fibroid, or in the FIGO stage, it is going to be type 0 FIGO stage, because it is completely intracavitary, right? And if we look at number 2, then that is what is submucosal, right? Where, please remember, type 1 is when more than 50% is intracavitary, okay? And FIGO stage 2, when less than 50% is intracavitary, okay? Whereas if you look at number 3, then this is what is intramural. Please remember, in general, the most common type of fibroid is intramural fibroid. To begin with, all fibroids are intramural. Then depending on where they grow, they can become submucosal, they can become subserosal. So most common is intramural. Don't mark it as submucosal. Submucosal is the least common type of fibroid, but yes, submucosal is most symptomatic. So although it is least common, but it is the most symptomatic, yes? And the most common symptom we all know is menorrhagia, right? Irregular cycles, but heavier blood loss. It usually does not cause irregular cycles, okay? Then, I'm not sure, but I did get one of the recalls as, which syndrome has a false positive Barr body? So, you know, what is a Barr body? It is an inactivated X chromosome. Yes, do you remember? So, if you remember, the number of Barr bodies is supposed to be X minus 1. So, if we talk about females, right? So, if we talk about normal females, karyotypically normal females, then they will have 1 Barr body because they have 2 X chromosomes. If you talk about normal male, right? They have no Barr body, right? So, a normal male will have no Barr body, but here the question is false positive, right? So, please remember XXY. Yes, what is this? This is Klinefelter syndrome. Yes, so this is a Klinefelter syndrome. They are male, so normally males should not have any Barr body. So if a male is having a Barr body, yes, it is likely to be Klinefelter syndrome, right? Because I said the number of Barr bodies is X minus 1. Remember that Klinefelter's is actually more common than Turner's syndrome. And we all know that in Turner's, the IQ is normal, but in Klinefelter's, it is subnormal IQ, right? They have subnormal IQ. Yes, they're going to be infertile, right? And those are the other features of Klinefelter's. So please remember these things, that it is much more common than Turner syndrome. So when they typically ask about the sex chromosome abnormality, what is more common? Don't answer it as Turner's, okay? Then another question that I got was this. I'm not sure if this was the particular image or not, but a 58-year-old female, painless growth for 2 years, and condylomata acuminata. Right? Or genital warts. Yes, you all know the causative agent is human papilloma virus, typically 6 and 11. Which are the ones which are more likely to cause cervical cancer? 16 and 18. Yes. What else does 6 and 11 do? Laryngeal papillomatosis. So remember, if a pregnant lady has genital warts and the baby is delivered vaginally, the baby is likely to have laryngeal papillomatosis. Okay. Then this was probably one of the x-rays that was shown, a postmenopausal woman, asymptomatic, with the following image, right? So such a big calcified structure in her pelvis, and yet she is asymptomatic. So this is very likely to be a calcified fibroid, right? And you know, in postmenopausal women, the fibroid undergoes shrinkage and it becomes asymptomatic, and it can get calcified as well. Okay, unlikely to be a bladder stone, because you know this is more eccentric, and such a big bladder stone and still the woman being asymptomatic is very unlikely, right? Again, some people thought that it could be dermoid, because I don't have the options, but I feel these would be the options in the question. Again, this is not the kind of calcification you see in a dermoid. Dermoid में सिर्फ एक तरफ ही calcification होता है at one edge, okay, which is Rokitansky protuberance, but not uniformly calcified like this, okay. So it's not a dermoid, it's not a bladder stone, it is a calcified fibroid, okay. Please remember, it is the subserosal fibroids which are more likely to undergo calcific degeneration, and then you know they're called as womb stones. Yes, then they are called as womb stones. Okay. Right. So this is another recall that I got. A female after delivery complains of cramps during breastfeeding. Which hormone is responsible? So I know this, they did mention breastfeeding, but here the answer is not prolactin. Okay. The answer is oxytocin. Remember that oxytocin is the milk ejection hormone. Right? So it causes release of milk from the lactiferous ducts, whereas prolactin is the milk producing hormone. And you know, because of the release of oxytocin, the uterus undergoes cramps or contractions, and it causes pain. So the answer here is oxytocin. Also, you know, a related question that they could ask is, which is the most important thing for initiation of lactation? So which of the following is most important for initiation of lactation? Don't answer it as prolactin, don't answer it as oxytocin. It is actually a fall in progesterone and estrogen. A sudden fall in progesterone and estrogen, which you see in these postpartum women, is what is actually the stimulus or the first stimulus, right, for initiation of lactation. और इसमें से अगर एक choose करना हो, then it is actually fall in progesterone as the single best answer, right? And another thing that they could ask related to prolactin and postpartum is that you have to know that after delivery, okay, prolactin levels fall. Okay, they don't increase, they actually fall, and they fall by 50%. And therefore you have to know that prolactin levels are actually highest during pregnancy and not during lactation. Okay. Another question for which I don't have the options as recall, but they had asked the mechanism of lactational amenorrhea, why there is amenorrhea in lactation. So you know this, when you talk about lactation, there is high levels of prolactin. So what does prolactin do? Prolactin does a negative feedback on GnRH, right? Which in turn will also have a negative feedback on FSH and LH, and this leads to amenorrhea. So this is the same mechanism that you see or is the cause of amenorrhea in hyperprolactinemia. Okay, so another thing that if they ask you what is the most common presentation of hyperprolactinemia, the single best answer is amenorrhea. Don't answer it as galactorrhea. No, it is not galactorrhea. The most common is amenorrhea, followed by infertility. Okay, so that's the recall that I have. Okay, no, another one for which again I don't have the exact question, but yes, I do have a statement as a question. So they said pregnant female with bleeding and tender uterus and no fetal heart tone. I've already discussed this. This is going to be abruption. So this is a classic presentation of antepartum hemorrhage, a tense tender uterus, okay, fundal height more than period of gestation, fetal distress or absent fetal heart rate, and you know, and this is usually altered bleeding. These are characteristic features of abruption. Since there are two questions, one for rupture uterus, one for abruption, I'm telling you the best way to understand this is the uterine contour. Okay, in in rupture uterus, the contour is not well felt, and it will be a generalized pain abdomen, okay, or a generalized tenderness. But when you talk about abruption, it is typically the uterus which is tender, the contour is well made out, and the fundal height will be more than the period of gestation. All right. So I hope you find this discussion useful. It is likely that you could get repeat questions, so you must go through these recalls and try and see what are the kind of topics and clinical questions they are framing. Okay. So all the very best. Thank you so much.